Hey guys, so I'm here to do the rundown of Chapter 3 from the book It by Stephen King. Chapter 3 is kind of split up into 6 different sections, as Mike Hanlon calls each adult version of the Losers Club. So I'm going to have to do 6 different videos for that, so they'll be a little bit shorter, and so that the video is not so long and you could watch at your leisure. Just a quick rundown of time. Little Georgie met his demise in 1957 in Chapter 1. In Chapter 2, Adrian Mellon met his demise in 1984, and at the time of the phone calls, the year is 1985. So this part is called Stanley Uris Takes a Bath. We're starting off with Stanley. In the miniseries, we end with Stanley, and I think that's because they do the flashbacks in the miniseries. In Chapter 3, that's not so. They rarely go back because they're starting to remember, as Mike Hanlon calls each one of them. And as you know, once they left Derry, they didn't really remember much about what happened in their childhood. But once Mike calls, it starts to flash back to all the things that happened, and they don't really tell too much about that after the phone call in the book. So basically, the Chapter 3 in the book is kind of talking about the adult versions of the Losers Club, kind of what happened after they left Derry. And for Stanley, he left Derry. He met his wife, and his wife's family didn't really like him. They thought he was kind of like a bum, but her parents were very mean to his wife Patty, and they were very judgmental, and it often put her down. And Stanley was kind of like her knight in shining armor, even though he didn't have a lot going for him at that time. And they thought, this is how mean they were, they thought he was a bum and that he was in a fail, and his failure would lead to them having to raise their daughter for the rest of their life. So that was going to be a disappointment for them, and that's kind of messed up to feel that way about your own kid, but that's kind of how they are. Like, the dad's a mean-spirited drunk. He's always calling her names and putting her down, and the mom is just very judgmental. So Stanley kind of rescues her from that, and even though they've gotten so far in life, she'll find herself sometimes sitting in their driveway, staring at their big giant house, and still feeling depressed and kind of angry about her past, because she's Jewish and she felt some discrimination as she was growing up. And even after, it mentions an after prom party where she and her date had to walk back to the car because they were denied entrance for her being Jew. I believe they call it kike in the book. And she can still hear the gravel sometimes crunching in her ears when they walked away. So it's something that deeply affected her because she still remembers it. And she'll find herself sitting in the driveway and realizing how far they come, and then all of a sudden being thrown back into what was. And so she's a very sad and sometimes angry person. But the one who levels her out also is Stanley. So her and Stanley are very much soulmates. And they moved to Georgia after she graduated college. She was trying to find a job as a teacher, and he kind of pointed to Georgia. There was different states, and he said he knew that was the place that they were meant to be. She asked him how he would know, and he just said he was certain of it. There's this feeling, and she thought it was kind of odd. And I'm only mentioning that because he suddenly goes into this trance, and he says, "The turtle couldn't help us." And if you've read the book, you know about the ancient turtle. If you haven't read the book, then you might not know about the ancient turtle. But it's a big deal in the book, and it wasn't covered in the miniseries, so it's definitely going to be covered in the book, and it's definitely going to be mentioned a lot. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Like in Chapter 1, when little Georgie found the little thing of turtle wax while he was looking for the paraffin in a cellar, and it kind of sent him into this trance. The same thing happens to Stan. He kind of goes into these trances every once in a while. He seems like a really happy guy. A lot of people really like him, but he's got these like inner demons that he's constantly struggling with. After she became a teacher, he became a bakery driver, and then he worked for H&R Block, and then he worked at Corridor Video. And since he was a nice, likable guy, he made a lot of contacts and was eventually landing all these different positions, and they gave him this opportunity, and he went into this video venture and became rich. And it kind of tells a little bit how they felt about that, well, at least Patty. So it says, this was the fabled land of 6 figures, and it had all happened with the casual ease of slipping into a pair of sneakers on Saturday morning. This sometimes frightened her. Once she had made an uneasy joke about deals with the devil. Stanley had laughed until he almost choked, but to her it hadn't seemed that funny, and she supposed it never would. The turtle couldn't help us. Sometimes, for no reason at all, she would wake up with this thought in her mind, like the last fragment of an otherwise forgotten dream, and she would turn to Stanley, needing to touch him, and needing to make sure that he was there. So again, the turtle runs through her mind, even though she probably has no clue what it means. It's just kind of there. And I thought it was funny that because it seemed so easy for them to become so successful, that she thought it was a deal with the devil. And I often think that of Stephen King, because, and I'm sure that's probably why he wrote it, because, I mean, the dude's got a lot of talent, and he's so famous, and his stories just go so crazy as soon as they come out. So I know that's been a thing that's been mentioned before, like, what did he make a deal with the devil? So that's just something I thought was weird. So anyways, her mother is constantly prodding her to have children, to make her a grandparent. And like I said, her parents aren't very nice. So they kind of throw this down a different way and kind of like insult her, where she's really sad about it and she gets depressed. They went to the doctor to find out why they couldn't have children, and they were both very healthy. The doctor said they shouldn't have any problem conceiving, and they just couldn't get pregnant. They had a huge house. They had an extra room waiting to fill it with a baby, and it just never happened for them. And Stanley knew it was him, and he mentioned that it was him, and she said no, that, you know, you couldn't know something like that, but inside she knew that it was true. And this is kind of like what he tells her. Sometimes, he said, sometimes I think I know why. Sometimes I have a dream, a bad dream, and I wake up and think, I know now. I know what's wrong. Not just you not catching pregnant. Everything. Everything that's wrong with my life. Stanley, nothing's wrong with your life. I don't mean inside, he said. From inside I'm fine. I'm talking about outside. Something that should be over, and it isn't. I wake up from these dreams and I think, my whole pleasant life has been nothing but the eye of a storm, and I don't understand. I'm afraid, but then it just fades, the way dreams do. She knew that he sometimes dreamed uneasily. On a half a dozen occasions he had awakened her thrashing and moaning. Probably there had been other times when she slept right through the dark interludes. Whenever she reached for him and asked him, he said the same thing, I can't remember. Then he would reach for his cigarettes and smoke sitting up in bed, waiting for the residue of the dream to pass through his pores like a bad sweat. So, Stanley is kind of disturbed about all of this, and it's kind of sad because he seems like a legit dude, and it's just something that haunts him. And if you remember in the miniseries, it does seem to affect him most, like fear-wise. The rest of them aren't as phased. Even though they're scared and afraid, it seems to be a lot deeper with Stanley. And it's something that even as an adult he can't get through. He's just really struggling with it. So another thing they kind of mentioned is that a few months before the bath, he discovers that Bill Denbrawl is a writer. And he kind of remembers him. He said it's like revisiting an old friend. He started reading all of the books and trying to suck up as much of it as he could. And he was even reading The Night of the Bath. But he told Patty that it was kind of like visiting an old friend, you know, kind of like an old chum. And he felt kind of really at home with it. And Patty, on the other hand, tried to read it and was very afraid. The books were very dark from Stuttering Bill. And she was very disturbed by it because it was just full of darkness and full of monsters. And she couldn't understand why her husband liked the books. And he actually felt at home with it. So it kind of tells a little bit about Stanley's character feeling at peace with the darkness and feeling like that was the sense of home, you know. Anyways, so the night of the phone call, Mike Hanlon calls and says, you know, it's come back. And Stanley goes into the living room and tells his wife he's going to go up and take a bath. Now, she knows something's wrong because she heard his voice. She knew it was odd. She thought it was strange that he wanted to take a bath at night. And she was watching Family Feud, not Perfect Strangers like in the miniseries, but she was watching Family Feud, and she had a huge crush on Richard Dawson, which was the host of Family Feud back then. So she didn't really pry too much because she wanted to finish watching the episode, and she let him go up and take a bath. Now, she is thinking about this as she's watching Family Feud, but she's kind of like telling herself also kind of get over it because, you'll go up and sit and see what's wrong in a little bit. And what she does, after the episode, she goes into the kitchen, she grabs a beer, she's planning on rubbing his back, listening to his sorrows. She knows that something happened during the phone call. She knows that he's not right with it, and she's heading upstairs to find out what's going on. And when she gets there, the door is closed, and this kind of frightens her too because he's never closed the door on her, really. It says like there's been that type of a couple where they leave the door open unless, you're using the restroom or whatever. But she had heard the water turn off like 10 or 15 minutes before, and the door being closed kind of freaks her out. And now the fact that his voice was so odd is really freaking her out. And her mind is starting to think that he's had some kind of heart attack and that he's in there and something's wrong. And she, all of a sudden, just ringing through her mind, she just hears like these dripping sounds, and it's like plink, plink, plink. So she's freaked out now, and she races for the door, and she tries to open it, and it's locked. And so it's kind of, with a moan, she gripped the cut glass doorknob and turned it. Yet still the door would not move. It was locked, and suddenly 3 nevers occurred to Patty Uris in a rapid succession. Stanley never took a bath in the evening. Stanley never closed the door unless he was using the toilet, and Stanley had never locked the door against her at all. So in their entire marriage, he never locked the door, and now the door is locked. And she's really freaking out. So she starts to pound on the door and scream his name, and he's not answering. As she's kind of going into this whole panic mode, she blacks out. She regains the control of her mind a little bit later, and she's downstairs, and she doesn't know how she got there. She doesn't know what's going on, and she can hear somebody's voice in her ear, and she realizes that she's downstairs and that she's holding a phone in her hand. And she drops the phone, and it says, panic was rising in her mind again. It was like a bitter black coffee threatening to overflow the rim of a cup. She closed her eyes and fought against it. She stood there, perfectly still, pale as a statue, with a pulse beating in its throat. Now she could remember running back down here, her feet stuttering on the stair levels, running for the phone. Oh, yes, oh, sure, but who had she meant to call? Crazily, she thought, I would call the turtle. But the turtle couldn't help us. It didn't matter anyway. She'd gotten as far as 0, and she must have said something not quite standard because the operator had asked if she had a problem. She had one, all right. But how do you tell a faceless voice that Stanley had locked himself in the bathroom and that he didn't answer? That steady sound of the water dripping into the tub was killing her heart. Someone needed to help her. Someone. So she's very distraught at this time. She's trying to figure out what she's supposed to do, and she remembers that they have spare keys in the kitchen. And Stanley was very meticulous, and they each had a spare key to every room in the house, and each one of them was labeled. So Patty snatched a key marked upstairs bath, began to run for the stairs, and then made herself walk. Running made the panic want to come back, and the panic was too close to the surface as it was. Also, if she just walked, maybe nothing would be wrong. Or if there was something wrong, God could look down, see she was just walking, and think, oh good, I pulled a hell of a boner, but I've got time to take it all back. I think that's kind of sad that she feels something's wrong with her husband, and she's hoping that it'll be fixed by the time she gets to the door. So she goes up there, she tries, to open the door. She could still hear the constant dripping, and her hand was shaking, and the key chattered all the way around the plate before finding its way into the keyhole and socking itself home. She turned it and heard the lock snap back. She fumbled for the cut glass knob. It tried to slide through her hand again, not because the door was locked this time, but because her palm was wet with sweat. She firmed her grip and made it turn. She pushed the door open. Stanley! Stanley! She looked at the tub with its blue shower curtain bunched at the far end of the stainless steel rod and forgot how to finish her husband's name. She simply stared at the tub. Her face was as solemn as the face of a child on her first day of school. In a moment she would begin to scream, and Anita McKenzie next door would hear her, and it would be Anita McKenzie who would call the police, convinced that someone had broken into the Uris house and that people were being killed over there. But for now, this one moment, Patty Uris simply stood silent with her hands clasped in front of her, against her dark cotton skirt, her face solemn, her eyes were huge. And now the look of almost holy solemnity began to transform itself into something else. The huge eyes began to bulge, her mouth pulled back into a dreadful grin of horror. She wanted to scream and couldn't. The screams were too big to come out. The bathroom was lit by fluorescent tubes. It was very bright. There were no shadows. You could see everything, whether you wanted to or not. The water in the tub was bright pink. Stanley lay with his back propped up against the rear of the tub. His head had rolled so far back on his neck that the strands of his short black hair brushed the skin between his shoulder blades. If his staring eyes had still been capable of seeing, she would have looked upside down to him. His mouth hung open like a sprung door. His expression was once of abysmal frozen horror. A package of Gillette Platinum Plus razor blades lay on the rim of the tub. He had slit his inner forearms open from the wrist to the crook of the elbow, and then had crossed each of these cuts just below the bracelets of fortune, making a pair of bloody capital T's. The glasses glared red-purple in the harsh white light. She thought the exposed tendons and ligaments looked like cuts of cheap beef. A drop of water gathered at the lip of the shiny chromium faucet. It grew fat. It grew pregnant, you might say. It sparkled. It dropped. Plink. He had dipped his right forefinger in his own blood and had written a single word on the blue tiles above the tub. Written in 2 huge, staggering letters, a zigzagging, bloody finger mark fell away from the second letter of his word. His finger had made that mark, she saw, as his hand fell into the tub, where it now floated. She thought Stanley must have made that mark, his final impression on the world, as he lost consciousness. It seemed to cry out to her. It. Another drop fell into the tub. Plink. That did it. Patty Uris at last found her voice. Staring into her husband's dead and sparkling eyes, she began to scream. So, as you know in the movie, it's very similar. Stanley wrote it on the wall, and that's very traumatizing for you to have to see your husband that way. And it's very sad because you know that he loved his wife, and you know that they were a very happy couple, and that they had a future planned out. And just the phone call and the thought of going back to Derry and the thought of having to face it again scared Stanley to death, you know. And I think that's very sad. So that is the story of Stanley Uris. You get a little bit of background on his adult life and his relationship with his wife Patty and the people who were around him at the time. So, all right, I hope that helped you guys. I'll be posting chapter 3, 6 phone calls. I think the next one is about Richard Tozier. So, till next time. Bye.